My name is Janie Nolan, and I'm the Executive Director of the American Avalanche Association, or as A3, as many people like to call it. And I'm really excited to welcome you to the second event in our 2023 Winter Webinar Series, an interactive presentation on equity and inclusion as risk management concerns for the avalanche industry. And this webinar actually came about this fall when I watched Jesse present at the Wyoming Stone Avalanche Workshop. And I was really moved and inspired by her presentation. And so she's made an adaptation of that presentation for us tonight, and she's made it extremely interactive. So I hope throughout the evening you gain some tools that you can use in your own operations, and you can enjoy interacting with both Jesse and the other attendees on this call. Before we begin, I want to thank the sponsors who make our webinar series possible. These generous partners really make A3's world go round. We couldn't do our work without them. And so I hope you will join me in thanking them and in supporting them as you make choices in the outdoor and avalanche industry. And with that, I will introduce our speaker here tonight, Jesse Quillian. Jesse is a senior field instructor for NOLS and has spent over 350 weeks on the NOLS backcountry expeditions. She has worked courses in the continental US, as well as in Alaska, Patagonia, India, Canada, and Italy. A significant portion of her field work has been in the winter and mountaineering programs, including instructor seminars, avalanche courses, and expeditions for aspiring outdoor educators. Jesse has taken students to the summit of Denali on 3 different expeditions via the Muldrow Glacier, and she recently supported climbers on the West Buttress as a member of the first all-women's NPS patrol. She currently lives in Lander, Wyoming. Jesse, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Janie. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Hi, everybody. It is really nice to be here facilitating this webinar. As Janie was saying, this fall, I was asked to prepare a presentation for WYSAW about equity and inclusion as risk management concerns. And my background is in outdoor and avalanche education. And I've had the good fortune to spend most of my career at NOLS, which is an organization that's paid more attention than many to the ways in which equitable and inclusive spaces are essential to student learning and development. If you all haven't had a chance yet to watch Aidan Goldie's WYSAW presentation from this fall, or to read his article in the Avalanche Review, it was TAR 40.3, I'd recommend that you do. In his article, which is called Intersectional Heuristics in Backcountry Decision-Making, Aidan Goldie presents the concept of intersectional heuristics as an addition to facets. He defines intersectional heuristics as shortcuts to decision-making driven by unbalanced power structures. But in order to take this additional decision-making trap into account, we first must identify the power structures themselves and understand how they're perpetuated in the avalanche industry and more broadly in the United States. My webinar is designed to help you do these things. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can share my screen. Janie, will you give me a thumbs up if you're seeing my screen?
We're seeing your screen.
Great, thank you. So on the shared screen are my learning goals for this evening. I hope that you become better able to identify ways in which power dynamics impact groups' abilities to manage risk, and become more aware of how your own identities influence how you manage risk and how others respond to you doing so. The Zoom format, as we all know by now, is a challenge. I'll make some requests of you at the outset, and you can decide whether the session is the right thing for you. Here are my asks. To the extent that it's possible, please keep your video on. When we break into small groups, this will be particularly important. When working in small groups, please also turn your mic on if possible. But when we're in the large group, if you could stay muted, that'd be great. You won't be asked to talk in a large group, but you will be asked to interact with each other in small breakout rooms. In these breakout sessions, please be kind, share talking time, and strive to give other participants your full attention. Consider these breakout rooms as a way to meet a handful of people you might not know who are working in the same industry you are. At various times, you'll also be asked to do some work independently. It'll be helpful if you have a Google Doc or other electronic word processing document pulled up, or a notebook and a pen or a pencil. And in the format of this session, you all will be spending some amount of time in unfacilitated spaces. There's potential freedom in this structure, and there's also some risk. If you feel uncomfortable or have concerns about what's happening in breakout rooms or with an individual, please direct message Janie. Please also remember that the AAA is a professional organization and that you're showing up as a professional to this webinar. Please represent yourself well and do your best to show up with compassion and curiosity. Please also feel free to exit the Zoom meeting at any time and for any reason if this session isn't working for you. To start, we're going to go into some randomly generated breakout rooms. Janie and I are going to try to keep these the same through the session, and we may or may not succeed in that, but our goal is that you're working with the same people in small breakout rooms through the rest of the evening. When I send you off, please introduce yourself to the people in your breakout room with your name, pronouns if you'd like to share them, where you're Zooming from or where you are right now, and one reason you're attending this session. We'll take about 10 minutes for these intros, and this should be more than enough time, and I recognize some people are still joining the call. So the goal is that you also have a little time to engage in some small talk. You can talk a little bit about your day, talk a little bit about your family, your job, but the goal is just that you start to build some rapport in these small groups to start everything. Okay, I think, Janie, I'm ready to go ahead and send folks into breakout rooms, and I'll put the prompts into the chat.
Sounds good.
Okay, so folks should now see what looks like a bullseye on your screen. I'm modifying an activity that is designed to build awareness of and empathy for others' experiences. I'll read a series of 10 statements describing things you're likely to have done or will do in the context of being an Avalanche professional. I want you to think about your emotional experience in these situations. If the situation would be highly stressful, you can imagine placing yourself in the red on the bullseye. If the situation would be relatively low stress for you, you might be in the orange or the yellow. If the situation causes you no stress, imagine yourself outside of the bullseye. As I go through these statements, please take note of the things that put you in the red and things that cause you no stress. Here we go. And you're just thinking about these things, you can jot down notes if you want. Speaking up when I think my supervisor is wrong. Giving constructive feedback to a young man in an Avalanche course. Giving constructive feedback to a young woman in an Avalanche course. Going to the bathroom when I'm working in the outdoors. Walking into a gear store in an affluent ski town when I need new equipment. Posting avalanche observations or pit results on a public forecasting site or platform. Skiing or riding for the first time in front of people I don't know. Reading out loud from the avalanche forecast in a morning guides meeting. Hanging out in the lobby at a snow and avalanche workshop when there's free beer available. And working in an instructor team, forecasting team, or patrol with only men as colleagues. All of these things could be highly stressful for some people and not at all stressful for others. Identity group membership, which we'll spend more time considering, can have huge impacts on the ways in which people move through the world. For example, I have a high level of education and had unlimited books as a kid. Reading out loud in front of other people is no big deal for me. On the other hand, every time I walk into a gear store, I feel flooded with adrenaline. I've been conditioned to anticipate that people assume I know little about outdoor equipment, and this makes for frustrating and often stressful interactions. The examples I've given include factors connected to identity group membership and factors connected to experience in the world or upbringing. We'll revisit these situations after we spend some time talking about identity groups. A social group or identity group is a group of people who share a range of physical, cultural, and social characteristics within one of the broadly accepted social identity categories. For each category, one identity group is dominant within the broader cultural context, and other identity groups are non-dominant or marginalized. This means that we are biased in favor of characteristics associated with a dominant identity group and against characteristics associated with non-dominant identity groups. Here's a visual. You can see that in the category sex, we have male, female, and intersex as social groups or identities, with male being the dominant or power-holding identity. When we look at these identity groups or social groups, these terms can be used interchangeably. We can see that some, like race, are generally visible, and some, like class, may be invisible. People who hold identities that are invisible may choose to pass, meaning that they don't challenge the assumption that they are a member of the dominant identity group. For example, I can pass as a straight woman, even though that's not how I identify. Now we're going to run through a second short activity to just get you thinking about the identities you hold and how these show up for you. Now you should see a list of identities on the screen. When I ask a question, again, I want you to choose an identity that answers the question for you at this time. You can just write this down or think about how you would answer. Here we go. A part of my identity that I'm aware of on a daily basis is. A part of my identity that I'm not aware of on a daily basis is. A part of my identity that allows me access to resources is. A part of my identity that keeps me from accessing resources is. A part of my identity that helps me as an Avalanche professional is. And a part of my identity that gets in my way as an Avalanche professional is. Now that you've had a brief opportunity to think about aspects of your identity, we're going to return to our original list of potentially stressful scenarios. You're going to go back into breakout rooms, and I'd like you to do the following. Again, I'll put all this information in the chat once you're in your little rooms. First, you're going to determine whether in your group you have full alignment on any of these situations. So are there any situations in which all of you either feel no stress or all of you feel high stress? If you're aligned in feeling high stress, what aspects of your identity might be contributing? And if you're aligned in feeling no stress, what aspects of your identity might be contributing? If you can't find alignment within your group, choose a situation in which people have different reactions. What aspects of identity might be informing your different reactions? And spend a little bit of time talking about this. We're only going to take about 5 minutes in this breakout room, so try to move through pretty efficiently. And again, I'll put the assignment and the list of situations in the chat so you'll have access to them in your breakout rooms. I lost my unmute button, but I found it. Now that we've spent some time thinking about identity group membership, we can start to talk about how power dynamics are connected to these identities. Power dynamics exist when one group of people, or identity group, has more or higher social status than another, and these power dynamics are maintained by dominant norms of behavior. In 2014, I wrote an article for the Knowles newsletter about my experience working the first section of a semester with all male students in 2011. In this article, I reflected on the feedback I received from students that I was the man, and on how pressure to perform in specific ways and rewards granted based on that performance caused me to unconsciously undermine my foundational objectives as a Knowles instructor, to create inclusive, welcoming, and equitable courses and communities. In short, I was psyched to be the man, and this revealed some unexamined sexism and sexist bias. The culture on this course, as I remember it, was outstanding. Students were motivated and took on physical challenges, wanting to dig snow shelters after long travel days and opting in to peak ascents and dawn patrol laps. Novice skiers were happily over-terrained and hucked themselves off of drops into soft powder. The group operated efficiently, dividing and conquering tasks. Friendly, supportive competition characterized students' relationships with each other, and instructors egged students on. I remember very little conflict, and what did arise flared quickly, then dissipated. I've remained connected to one of the students on this course who has very different memories of the experience. He told me years later that on the winter section he was bullied by peers, that everyone acted like dicks, and that the culture of the group deteriorated in subsequent semester sections in ways that had direct impacts on students' ability to perceive and manage objective hazards. For better and worse, this course perpetuated many dominant culture norms. When I talk about dominant culture norms, I'm talking about the norms shared by members of dominant identity groups: white, straight, cis, owning class, educated, adult men. We're going to try out the chat feature to see if this works for us tonight. What I'd like you to do is come up with one or two Avalanche industry norms that you can describe in a word or short phrase. You can also think of dominant norms as attributes for which you would likely be rewarded in your job in the Avalanche industry. A few examples I might choose are perfectionism, strong work ethic, punctuality, and confidence. So let's give this a try. If folks take a minute, try to come up with a norm of the Avalanche industry and go ahead and type that in the chat.
Can you repeat the question, Jesse?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. If you can come up with an Avalanche industry norm or something that you can think of it as something that you would be rewarded for in your job. Like you might be rewarded for being confident. You might be rewarded for always being on time, for perfectionism. Those were some examples I came up with. Yeah. Now we're getting some in here. Hardworking, physical fitness. Those are really good examples. Pushing the edge, focused. Ski ability. I think that's a really big one. Getting up early. Yeah, again, hard work coming up. I think periods of really high intensity work. Pushing the limits of what you can do in a work week. Great. Thanks, folks, for doing some chatting. I recognize that might be a real high risk to use the chat in a big group. So adhering to or being influenced by dominant norms, more are coming in, and folks should please keep putting these in. These are going to serve us in where we're going next. So living within these norms and being influenced by them can impact our risk management. I'm going to share a couple examples of norms and biases that have caused me to make poor decisions and some learnings I'm trying to pull from these things. I'm going to give 2 examples, and then you all will have an opportunity to reflect and think about examples from your own experience. Great. So the first norm I was thinking about was individualism and confidence. As Avalanche professionals and ski guides, we often experience pressure to open complex terrain. I remember an experience relatively early in my career when I felt pressure from the people I was responsible for to ski a line that we'd been looking at for days. Simultaneously, I felt institutional pressure to prove that I could manage novices independently in complex terrain in order to be promoted. These factors combined to create a scenario in which it was incredibly hard for me to ask to collaborate with colleagues in assessing avalanche hazard. Or once I'd made a decision to enter into complex terrain, to allow any observations or test results to shift this decision. So I was operating really autonomously and needed to present a high degree of confidence. Things that I think could help or mitigate these norms are asking for and sharing input in teams, asking my ski partners, I think especially ski partners who have less experience than I do, how they feel about a decision or an objective, and paying attention to my gut, right? The sense that I don't feel good about this, I don't totally know why, be enough to turn around or back down from an objective. So the norm being individualism, confidence, and these are 3 things I'm trying to do to mitigate that. Another example, and this has to do with implicit bias. Several years ago, I was working with 2 other people to lead a high altitude traverse in the Kumon Himalayas. In our team, I had the most formal avalanche education and practical experience. However, I consistently deferred to the person in a hierarchical position of leadership, a person who also possessed many dominant identity characteristics, to make decisions about avalanche hazard exposure. These decisions were different from the ones I would have made, and we had one near miss when a wet, loose D4 avalanche buried our track a couple hours after we'd moved through. Throughout this course, I conflated expertise in one area, a depth of experience leading trips in India, with expertise in another, managing avalanche hazard in the spring of a particularly high snow year. I also made assumptions about this person's experience based on his presentation and his embodiment of dominant identity characteristics: confidence, certainty, independent decision-making, and direct communication. To make my own implicit biases more apparent, I'm trying to ask myself in the moment what assumptions I'm making about my own and others' experience and what informs these assumptions. I'm also trying to identify the stories I might be unconsciously creating through my actions. For instance, if I, as a member of an instructor team, always confirm my co-instructor's pit results by digging my own pit, I may be undermining students' trust in my colleagues. If I wear nothing but technical gear to the orientation before an expedition, I might be suggesting that people who can't afford this gear shouldn't be on the expedition. So now I'm going to have you do something similar to what I just did with these examples. I want you to first come up with a risk management scenario that you were a part of that was driven or influenced by a dominant culture norm or by unconscious bias. We'll take 5 minutes to do this, and you'll do this independently. Jot some notes down if that's helpful to you. After 5 minutes, we'll send you into breakout rooms, and you're going to share your stories and then collaborate on some learnings or things you might do differently if confronted by a similar scenario in the future. Okay. So again, you have 5 minutes on your own. Come up with a risk management scenario you were involved in that was influenced by a dominant culture norm. Then you'll get sent into your rooms, you'll share your story, and try to come up with some learnings collectively. And we'll spend about 5 minutes having some independent time and 5 minutes in breakout rooms. If folks have questions, feel free to ask questions in the chat at any time too. So you all just spent a little bit of time thinking about how dominant culture norms impacted risk management. Cultural norms are not inherently good or bad, but they are often unexamined. How do you think about me as an avalanche professional, for example, if I told you that I've never been caught in or triggered an avalanche? Would you take me more or less seriously? And how might this subconsciously influence my decision-making in avalanche terrain? Cultural norms are also self-perpetuating. I spent a long time writing a bio for YSAW this fall, and my final draft was really different than my first draft. Here's what I started with. I'm going to put my rough draft bio on the screen and just give you a few minutes to read it, if I can figure out how to do that. So from the bio I started with, then came the bio that I submitted, which was the same one that Janie read this evening. Here it is. And I'll give you a second to read this. Neither of these bios are more or less true, but the latter is certainly designed to gain me credibility with a very specific audience. I wanted to be taken seriously as a speaker, particularly given that my presentation was not aligned with many of the cultural norms of avalanche professionals we've identified. I didn't use graphs or charts, and I relied on storytelling instead of data collection. I'd like you now to take a moment and grab a piece of paper or pull up a Google Doc on your computer. You're going to set your doc up to look something like this. Your paper will be divided into 2 columns, where in the left column, You're going to list things about yourself that you really care about and that you think are the most important things going on for you right now. So the things that you really care about in your world. And then in the right-hand column, you're going to list things that you would want an audience at a snow and avalanche workshop to know about you if you were presenting. And I'm just going to give you 2 minutes to do this. Just jot down the first things you think about. So things you really care about, things you would really want avalanche professionals to know about you. Okay. 2 minutes feels like a long time when I'm sitting by myself here. Now that you've created some lists, look back at them. Is there significant overlap between the columns? Is there significant disconnect? If your columns look similar, how might you be unconsciously perpetuating dominant norms? If your columns look different, are there opportunities for you in your professional life to more consistently share or integrate the things you care about? In part as a way to foster more inclusive environments. How do the things you put in the right-hand column reinforce cultural norms of avalanche professionals? And do any of these things subvert dominant norms? In linguistics, code switching occurs when a speaker alternates between 2 or more languages or language varieties in the context of a single conversation or situation. More recently, the term code switching has evolved to include how a person, typically a person in an underrepresented group, changes behavior in order to assimilate to dominant norms. Adjusting your bio, your presentation, or the way you talk to people could be considered code switching. Code switching is one way in which dominant culture is maintained, even the norms that might be problematic or cause us to make bad decisions. Code switching can also take a psychological toll. Imagine operating in an avalanche environment while speaking a language that you don't know well. Do you think that this would impact your ability to perceive and respond to hazards? When the dominant culture of an industry or organization is out of step with people's cultures outside of the organization, individuals might feel like their authentic self is unacceptable, expend a lot of emotional energy assimilating to dominant norms, or both. In 2021, the Harvard Business Review published an article entitled "Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome." Imposter syndrome is a psychological occurrence in which an individual doubts their skills, talents, or accomplishments, and has a persistent internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud. The article suggests that for people who have non-dominant identities, not man, not white, not cis, etc., feeling like an outsider is not an illusion. It's a result of systemic bias and exclusion. The concept of stereotype threat can help us understand some of the additional pressures and stressors that may be impacting people in non-dominant identity groups. Stereotype threat is a situation in which people are or feel themselves to be at risk of conforming to stereotypes about their social group. Often this fear or anxiety markedly decreases individuals' performance. Factors that increase stereotype threat can include the difficulty of the task, the belief that the task measures abilities, and being reminded, either implicitly or explicitly, about non-dominant identity group membership or stereotypes associated with that identity group. Code switching, imposter syndrome, and stereotype threat are consequences of maintaining systemic inequality and are emotionally costly to individuals. As people who work in high-risk environments, we should be cognizant of these emotional and energetic expenditures and look for opportunities to shift culture in order to minimize them. These phenomena also function to maintain homogeneity within an organization. We'll talk more about culture shift at the end of the presentation, but hopefully these concepts can help you understand the importance of affinity spaces, increased representation, and having mentors whose lived experiences are similar to yours. We're going to shift into talking about systems of power and how these operate and function in the world and in the Avalanche industry. To start out, we're going to spend some time looking at mainstream publications related to the outdoor and Avalanche industries. 3 examples I chose were Outside Magazine, Alpinist Magazine, and Backcountry Magazine, though there are many other examples I could have chosen. What you're going to do now is choose one of these 3 publications, an online website, or another publication of your choosing. It could be online or it could be a hard copy magazine if you have a magazine at hand. But I want you to choose something that is a product of or connected to the outdoor industry. So you're looking for a magazine or a website connected to the outdoor industry. And you're going to spend the next 5 minutes looking closely at the website or publication of your choosing. Try to examine this with fresh eyes, as though you don't know anything about the activity or the outdoors. And as you do so, I'm going to have you try to answer a list of questions, and I'll put these questions up on the screen. And you can jot down some notes in response to these questions. So take 5 minutes, look at a magazine or a website related to the outdoors, and try to come up with answers to these questions. Okay, we're going to come back together and we'll use the chat feature again. And the first thing, people can go ahead and put in the chat answer to who is represented in whatever you are looking at. Great. So physically fit, people who are able-bodied, who else are folks seeing in their publication? Good-looking people. Yep. White males, few females, famous people, white men with doctorates. Yep, affluent people, leisure time. Great. And who did you not see in these publications? So one Black person who's a famous athlete was represented. Oh, there's some real data collection. Thank you. No moderate athletes, only extreme athletes. Yep. Not a single person of color. Yep. Yep, no people with disability. Yep. Great. So it seems like as you were looking critically at these texts, you likely noted, in addition to who is represented and who is not represented, that the people who are in these magazines are often doing things by themselves and are often doing things that are really extreme. You may have concluded, based on what people are wearing, the tools they're using, and the advertisements in the magazine, that in order to spend time outside, you have to have a lot of money. One thing I noticed for the first time when I practiced this activity a couple of days ago was how many rules there are about how to do things in the outdoors. For example, never leave home without a trekking pole, or this is the best way to shop for used gear, or 4 buckle boots are out. That was something I hadn't noted before. Publications like these, magazines, websites, films and videos about the outdoors, and literature written about alpinism and exploration help to sustain a number of narratives about who belongs in the outdoors and who doesn't. To understand how outdoor publications contribute to structural racism, sexism, homophobia and transphobia, and ableism in our industry, we can look at a model that describes a self-sustaining loop. And we'll use sexism in the outdoor industry as an example to walk us through this model. So dominant narratives about sex and gender, coupled with sexist norms and differential outcomes based on sex and gender, prime us all to believe at some level that women and non-binary or gender expansive people are inferior to men, and to make assumptions about who can do what. This bias is often unconscious, and it's informed and sustained by the narratives we consume. Historically, association and assumptions about sex and gender led to policies and practices that justified excluding women from voting, owning property, getting an education, and holding certain jobs. As a contemporary example, many companies and organizations that support extended wilderness experiences prohibit pregnant people from participating. Since the vast majority of people who become pregnant are women, and pregnancy happens for most people at a time in life when they might also be achieving professional success or advancement, policies like these, while intended to protect individuals from harm, also consolidate and protect power for cis men and maintain inequality. History, policies, and practices result in inequitable outcomes and sex and gender-based disparities. And these inequitable outcomes reinforce sexism, promoting manness as normal and desirable. And we create a self-perpetuating loop. This model helps to explain why our community remains so largely homogeneous. We can also understand why systems that maintain inequality may be less obvious or visible to people who hold primarily dominant identities. If you are benefiting from systems of power, you likely don't see them. Making these systems visible and knowing how they are perpetuated gives us some power in dismantling them. Systems of bias and prejudice that maintain and reproduce social power can be conscious or unconscious and operate in different ways in 3 contexts. On the social cultural level, power is maintained through values, beliefs, and customs. For example, when I climb a popular boot pack off of Teton Pass, I see men peeing with their backs turned toward me, but otherwise in full view. This perpetuates a system that normalizes functions of cis male bodies, adding strain on people who squat to pee or people whose genitals don't match their gender expression. On the institutional level, power is maintained through policies, practices, and norms. For example, outdoor retailers sell men's and women's clothes. When I apply for a pro deal, I can only order clothes of one gender. This perpetuates a system that only recognizes two genders and that forces people to choose between them. And on the individual level, power is maintained through attitudes and behaviors. For example, in Denali National Park, the person behind the desk at the campground asked me if I had tried a smaller mountain first, when I told them I was leading a group up Denali. So what do we do to change culture? I'd first like to share a case study from the oil industry. In 1997, Shell began building a deepwater platform that, when completed, would become the world's deepest offshore oil well. To that point, oil rigs have been characterized by certain rules. Men who worked on them were tough, they worked under any conditions, and they didn't question authority or leadership. It also wasn't unusual to see someone die on an oil rig. Shell recognized that something needed to change if this new well was to be built and operated safely. The company hired a leadership consultant who suggested that the change needed was in how the men working on the rig dealt with their feelings. In short, the consultant proposed a radical shift away from entrenched dominant culture norms to norms that required vulnerability. As the men became more open with their feelings, other communication flowed more freely. People asked each other for help, saying things like, "I can't lift this by myself, and I'm not sure how to read this meter." The vulnerability contributed to an 84% decline in Shell's accident rate company-wide, not just on the deepwater platform. In that same period, the company's level of productivity exceeded the industry's previous benchmark. The old way of being an oil rig worker, the stoicism, the self-reliance, the individualism, the confidence, had in fact been endangering workers and reducing efficiency. I share this example because I think that there are a lot of parallels between Avalanche industry culture and oil industry culture. In both, people have historically been rewarded for independence and self-reliance, stoicism, hard work, and confidence. In both, these traits or norms can lead to decisions that put people at risk. And in both, I believe that more vulnerability not only improves risk management, but makes these working environments more accessible to more people. We'll conclude the webinar with some personal action planning. I'd like you to keep this example from the oil industry in mind, and I'm also going to introduce one more model designed to increase personal accountability. It's called the ladder of accountability. And I use this model often on NOLS courses. I found it to be really helpful both to me and to my students. This tool can help you identify where you are in relation to a problem or challenge you might be facing. The behaviors at the bottom of the ladder are less accountable behaviors, such as blaming other people, making excuses, saying I can't, and waiting and hoping. Behaviors near the top of the ladder, acknowledging reality and embracing it, looking for solutions and enacting those solutions, are accountable behaviors. How many people have opted to wait and hope when stuck in a tent in a storm? I certainly have. When I feel stuck in a challenging adaptive problem, locating myself on this ladder can start to provide me some direction. This ladder has been amended to serve as a tool for people who hold dominant identities and are invested in dismantling systems of power. Less accountable behaviors include thinking I'm normal, wanting people who hold non-dominant identities to just be like me. I think this mindset and the behaviors engendered by it require people in non-dominant identities to code switch all the time in the Avalanche industry. Being defensive. I think I've heard folks say, but I ski with women who rip, so I can't be sexist. I think that would be an example of just denying that there's a problem or being defensive in that problem. And feeling guilt and shame. Behaviors that can help move the needle in terms of dismantling systems of power include recognizing that there is a problem, taking responsibility for your own complicity, and we are all complicit, and making meaningful behavior change and taking action. And then finally, the ladder has been amended to also be a tool for people who hold non-dominant identities. And that ladder looks like this. For people in non-dominant groups, recognition of identity often comes very early in life, versus for people who are in dominant groups, identity might be invisible to them for a long time. Anger and depression are reasonable responses to inequitable treatment, and these emotions provide foundation for or motivation for, but don't necessarily directly affect system change. Affinity spaces are designed to provide people relief from stressors like code switching and stereotype threat. And then learning more about oneself and working to understand how systems of power function are accountable actions that people in non-dominant social groups can take. These actions may then allow them to more effectively challenge dominant norms. And the idea is that these ladders are working in conjunction with each other. So we're going to take a break for a final 10 minutes. And I think for this 10 minutes, go ahead, feel free to turn your video off and give yourself some space to just feel like you have some privacy from the Zoom screen. And you're going to spend some time in kind of independent thought and writing. I'm going to put directions on the board, or on the screen. Your first step is going to be to locate yourself on one of the two ladders with respect to fostering equity and inclusion in your professional role. Be honest with yourself and recognize that you will move, sometimes week to week, sometimes day to day, sometimes hour to hour, and that you might be in different places on these ladders with respect to different problems you're encountering, or with respect to different aspects of your own identity. To truly support inclusion and equity, you should strive for steady progress toward more consistently more accountable behaviors. The next thing I'd like you to do is reflect a little bit on your current working environment. How are dominant norms being perpetuated? Are these norms excluding people who have historically been underrepresented in the Avalanche industry? And what are some tangible things that you could do from whatever your role or place in the industry is? Great. So we'll take a private 10 minutes, take some time to brainstorm, and then we will come back together to conclude this webinar. Right around, we'll come back together. We'll say, let's take however many minutes gets us to 7:55, and then we'll have about 5 minutes of conclusion. Yeah. We're gonna conclude by looking at one way to visualize the difference between equality, equity, and transformation. Equality means that everyone has the same box. And if you're tall enough to see over the fence, you're in luck. When we're talking about equity, we're talking about structural, technical changes that take account of the ways in which systems of power have operated and continue to operate. These are things that are often highly politicized, and that may feel, if you have historically held power, uncomfortable, threatening, or oppressive. And then when we talk about transformation, we're talking about imagining a world without the fence. On an industry scale, transformation is long-term work, potentially longer than any of our lifetimes. However, I challenge you to imagine, within small teams, what a transformative space could look like. Participating in this seminar is an action you've taken. Other actions can include supporting or creating affinity spaces in your workplace, providing mentorship and development opportunities to people who are underrepresented in the industry, advocating for or enacting equitable hiring practices, and maybe most importantly, continuing your own education. As you continue through your winter season, I encourage you to reflect on the norms we all perpetuate, consciously or unconsciously. Which of these are serving us, and which are, like on the Deepwater rig, putting ourselves and our peers at risk? I hope we all keep looking for ways to not only improve technical risk management, but to make our entire industry safer and more welcoming for more people. Thanks. I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Jesse. That was really great. And I think hopefully everyone has something that they can take into their own organizations and spheres and implement. And I love your sentiment that sometimes the best thing you can do is continue to research and educate yourself. So when you're feeling powerless, that's such a great place to start. Just so everyone knows, Jesse and I will send a follow-up email with the resources that she mentioned. So if you were want to read the article about imposter syndrome for women, or stop telling women to have imposter syndrome, things like that, we'll include links to everything. That should come out either tomorrow or first thing Monday. So just stay tuned. And then lastly, I just want to thank Jesse. Thank you for being vulnerable and sharing your skill set with us. You are uniquely positioned to do this as someone who is both in our community, but has a good grasp of this work. So thank you. And then also I want to thank our sponsors again, in particular, CIL Explosives, Snowbound Solutions, Beeson Avalanche Control, Backcountry Access, and MND Safety. We truly could not do these webinars without them. So if you see any of those folks around, tell them thank you too. And have a good rest of your evening.